Hello, everyone. Welcome to Navigating Perilous Times, Remembering David McCullough. Thank you for coming, and welcome to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. We are happy to have you with us here and wherever you are on Zoom. I am Richard Kaplan, Manager of Reference Services, which is next door, big room. For 127 years, Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh has been a leader in the delivery of information and knowledge to this region. The library's role goes hand in hand with the works of authors like Mr. McCullough, placing significant events in order, providing facts, making information accessible, letting us draw our own conclusions, and even entertaining us. We hope that you will find today's program informative and engaging. Today's panelists, whom you will be introduced to shortly, will be sharing their memories and knowledge of the late McCullough, born here and raised in Point Breeze. And we have some housekeeping. So first of all, the modern version of the librarian's shh. Please mute or turn off your phones. Restrooms are through my left, the door behind you on that side. Women's room is right out here to the right. Men's room is down the hall on the right side. There are paper and pens that will be given to you to submit questions for the panelists as time allows. Please give your questions to one of our staff people collecting them. I think you were all given or offered the option of taking red raffle tickets. At the end of the program, we will draw tickets to give away 16 David McCullough paperbacks. Finally, I want to acknowledge the staff and technicians who've put today's event together, made the various arrangements, and recognize Andrew Medler, CLP President and Director, for his encouragement and interest in having this program and others like it. Thank you very much. Our moderator today is Pittsburgh filmmaker and actor Mary Rawson. For many years, she worked as a filmmaker, writing and producing documentaries and dramas for WQED and shown on PBS. For WQED, she also produced and hosted Lyceum, a weekly television program which featured interviews with local and national artists, including David McCullough. She continues to work as a teaching artist and actor. Her all-time favorite role is as Cousin Mary on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. She is a proud member of SAG-AFTRA and Actors Equity. Mary.
Thank you. How delightful to be here together, out of the cold, with a prospect of talking about and thinking about David McCullough for the next time we have together. I am honored to be here with this distinguished panel, Richard Burkert, Andy Masich, Tom McMillan, and Frank Lucchino. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly before we get started, so you know who they are.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah?
I'm Richard Burkert. I'm a longtime CEO of the Johnstown Area Heritage Association, and the first thing I had to do when I came there many years ago was a huge upgrade in what is called the Johnstown Flood Museum. And it was kind of a sketchy place. Unbelievably, we're celebrating our 50th year anniversary this year. But at the time, it had no money, all we had was a really good story. And the reason I went there with this seemingly impossible task ahead of us, and for me personally, was because I read David McCullough's first book, The Johnstown Flood, and realized what a rich historical event the Johnstown disaster it was and is, but the town was really at the cutting edge of steel technology and some of the transformative forces that changed America and made it a modern industrial nation. So I wanted to be there and do this, and
that's great.
Rest is history.
Yeah, thank you. Andy.
Andy Masich. I'm the president and CEO of the Senator John Heinz History Center, a proud affiliate of the Smithsonian Institution and Pennsylvania's largest history museum, right in the Strip District next to the Convention Center. And I've been there for 25 years, but from the very beginning, inspired by David McCullough, who is one of the architects of the modern history center that we know and love today.
Great. Tom.
The always awkward introduction of yourself. People who know me a bit know me as VP Communications for the Penguins for many years, but the people who really know me know that my real passion is not sports, it's history. I've somehow been able to publish 3 books on history, one on Flight 93, 2 on the Civil War, and have another one coming out early this summer on the original Star Spangled Banner. Served with Andy on the board of the Heinz History Center for many years. And just am so honored to be here because David McCullough, even though I didn't know him, has had such a huge influence on my life and my writing. So it's really great to be here.
Great, great. And Frank?
Well, I'm a retired judge, and people might wonder who didn't know anything about me, what in the world am I doing on this panel? I've had the great fortune to be a trustee both at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh and at the Heinz History Center, and got to meet David even before Andy got there 25 years ago. And my background becomes a little bit relevant. I've had various political offices, but as county controller, I wrote a report called The Quiet Crisis that highlighted the problems in public libraries in Allegheny County and set the stage for the regional asset district funding of public libraries. As I've said to Andrew Medlar when he came aboard, I've become a zealot for public libraries, and converts are the greatest zealots. I've chaired the board. Once we separated from the museum, the Carnegie Library used to be part of the museum structure. Once we separated, I was the first chair of the library board for several years and chaired the campaign to get the dedicated library tax for the library, and was involved in raising the $58 million that we had to raise to redo all the libraries. If you've not visited some of the branches, they've all been redone. And I had a great opportunity to spend a lot of time with David and his wife, Rosalie, and I'll be happy to share whatever that is with all of you.
Great. Thank you, Frank. I think, as you can see, the people who are here in this room, it's the only thing better might be, retiring with one of David's books and spending the next couple of hours reading David's work. But every one of you has a unique perspective on David McCullough. So I think my first question might be a personal one. How did you first come to know David McCullough, either through his work or in person? Tom, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, because most of the people on the panel did know him personally, and I didn't. So I'm like most of you, I didn't. And yet he had such an influence with his writing. The first book I read was the Johnstown Flood book. And it was just up in Johnstown last night. And we were just talking earlier about how it's similar when you go to a Civil War battlefield. Once you've been there, you can really understand the book. It was interesting going back to Johnstown after reading that book. And then my favorite book, John Adams, in 1776, and the Wright brothers, it's tough to rank them. But the one thing I would say is, I'm sure this might have even happened to Mr. McCullough, but as a writer, you sometimes have bad writing days. Whether it's writer's block or whatever, you sit there, you write one sentence, and 3 hours later, it's still one sentence. And that happens. Whenever that happens to me, I go to the bookshelf and pull out a David McCullough book. And I just open it in the middle and read 3 or 4 pages, and then miraculously, I'm okay. So even though I didn't know him, he's had such a huge influence and continues to have an influence on what I've done, and I know what so many of you have done as well.
That's great. Andy, how about you?
I met David through his writing, through his books, but when I accepted the job at the Heinz History Center, one of the first people I had to meet was David McCullough. He was someone who inspired the whole idea of a history center. Many of you longtime Pittsburghers know the Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania used to be here in Oakland on Bigelow Boulevard in the shadow of the Syria Mosque. And it was an old historical society that started in 1879, Pittsburgh's oldest cultural institution, and yet nobody even knew it was there. And David McCullough said that a city like Pittsburgh, with a history as rich as Pittsburgh's past, needs a first-class, a world-class history museum. And so that's how the idea of the History Center came about. And they hired me, they recruited me from Denver, Colorado, where I was heading up the Colorado Historical Society. And I fell in love with Pittsburgh people immediately, the rich history, but my meeting with David McCullough cemented the deal because he was so passionate about Pittsburgh. He said that if you can understand Pittsburgh, you can understand the American experience. It's the essential American city. That's how I first met David McCullough.
What a great way to meet him. That's great. How about you, Richard?
Two quick stories. Andy was saying how much David McCullough loved Pittsburgh. He went out of his way to tell me again and again how much he loved the people of Johnstown. Because he came to Johnstown. He had worked for American Heritage magazine, I think, largely, and he started his book, and he spent a lot of time there, and he had a great affection for the place. I, in the mid-'80s, was head of this group and charged with the job of providing a modern, involving museum experience. So I figured out very quickly that my best chance of success was to get as close to David as I could. And he had come to Johnstown for the University of Pittsburgh campus up there to speak in '85. And I arranged to meet with him afterwards, and I explained how I wanted to do a film and could we work together. And he was gracious, of course. He always was gracious. But he explained that he met this new filmmaker, Ken Burns. And they're going to make a film, and he urged me to organize my photos, and they'd be back. Well, as time went by, we raised the funds to do that museum, and I had a producer, Charles Guggenheim, do this film, which then won the 1989 Academy Award for Best Documentary Short. Right. And then WGBH Boston, which produced the American Experience series, came to us and said, well, we want to use your film, but we can't pay for it. But I was then able to arrange to have David was the host of that show. And so I got him, he did the intro and exit from the new Johnstown Flood Museum. One other quick story, because this is still unknown, relatively unknown. Johnstown, the Bethlehem Steel plant earlier at Canby Iron Works, is a National Historic Landmark. And when Bethlehem shut down there, largely shut down, the plant closed, and Bethlehem had started demolition in the most historic part of that. And we were trying to preserve some of the buildings there because they had really immense historic value. And the buildings go down, going down, in the lower works, which again, some of them gone back to mid-19th century. And in desperation, I'd written to David and asked him to, intervene with the chairman of Bethlehem Steel, and he did contact Kurt Barnett. And those buildings, the complex of them are still there. They've been acquired by the Center for Metal Arts, which is a black, metalworking school that's attracting an international student.
Once again,
David
made something happen.
Yeah. No, he was a friend of Johnstown.
So, Frank, I think you knew David personally, is that right?
Oh, yeah, I sure did. And it was one of the great pleasures of my life was getting to know David. And I met him about contemporaneously with doing some things for the Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania at their new quarters, which is the former Chautauqua Ice Building, and also library events. David was involved with both. The issue at the Historical Society, which is now Heinz History Center, came about because they were about $4 million short of executing their option to buy the building. And they asked me if we knew where we could help them with $4 million through the county. And I happened to know where we could do that, but you had to get the permission of Commissioner Forster. And so we set up a meeting with Commissioner Forster, and David McCullough came, completely charmed, and convinced Commissioner Forster of the great value of that history center. We came up with some creative financing so they could then buy the Chautauqua Ice Building, and the rest is history, as Andy has guided it for the last 25 years. And we just became friends, and how we did so many things together is just serendipitous. he's just a wonderful man, and getting to know his wife Rosalie, as Andy knows her too. Can't know David without knowing Rosalie.
Right, right.
Could I just piggyback on that?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Frank mentioned Rosalie, and David would never begin a talk without recognizing the love of his life, Rosalie Barnes, who he met here as a teenager at a dance.
Right.
And he always said that she was the editor-in-chief and the head of the ethics committee.
Right, right. Remember that.
And so you really can't understand David without knowing Rosalie, and they passed away within months of one another. There was a love for the ages.
Right, right. We keep referring to Pittsburgh, and David always called himself a Pittsburgher, even though he hadn't lived in Pittsburgh for years. So, and as you pointed out, Andy, he said it was, sort of the city, the lens through which you could tell the whole history of America. But what was it about Pittsburgh that made David who he was? Any thoughts about that? What do you think, Frank? Frank, what do you think?
Oh, I just think David was of Pittsburgh. I mean, he might have lived in a lot of other places, but he was of Pittsburgh. His whole family was here. He came back frequently. And he just loved the spirit, I think, of the city and the people. And I think he always felt that, even though he might have lived in Martha's Vineyard and in Boston and in Maine, that he was a true Pittsburgher.
Yeah, I think that's right. What about you, Andy? What do you think?
I agree with Frank. There was something about the people of Pittsburgh, their can-do spirit, that entrepreneurial bent. He said that people from river cities are different. And this was the gateway to the West. He knew that. He incorporated Pittsburgh in every story he wrote. You can find it in the footnotes, or you can find it in the index of every story. But I think it seeped into his soul as a boy, growing up, sitting around the dinner table. His father was a great storyteller, and he would tell stories of Pittsburgh history every night. And one that always sticks in my mind is one of his earliest memories as a boy was they would have a big plate of there'd be corned beef or something, but there'd be a big pile of mashed potatoes. There'd be gravy in the lake there, and there would be peas on the plate. And David would smash the dam of the mashed potatoes and flood the peas with gravy, and he would shout out, "The Johnstown Flood!" Those are his early Pittsburgh memories.
Thank you, Andy. I was going to tell it.
Oh, darn, I'm sorry.
That's a great story. Tom, do you have any thoughts about why Pittsburgh was so important?
Thanks for following up on it. You asked me to follow up on Andy. It's always a nice thing to do. I think, as one who grew up here, I think all of us who grew up here have part of Pittsburgh with us. So I'm not surprised that that's the case. You take that with you, and you could see that, even though he didn't have the accent, you could tell he was from Pittsburgh. And I don't think it's surprising that, even though it's not quite Pittsburgh, that Johnstown, his first book was on Western Pennsylvania. He understood the people and the ethos and the drive and what made those people, make that town successful. So I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think that's part of it. I guess I just always had wished he would have written books on two more topics. One was something on the Civil War, and the other was on Pittsburgh. I wanted to write something about Pittsburgh, but he gave us so many great books. I guess we can't complain.
Yeah. Richard, what do you think? I mean, you mentioned Johnstown, but
again, I think it was really concrete feel for the people. The Johnstown flood in particular. It's almost cinematic. He intuitively knows these characters living in it once again an industrial immigrant center,
right?
And he's so close. He tells it in such a compelling. And it's based on memoirs and recollections, but there's such immediacy, and it's obviously a town and a people that he's they're Pittsburgh, may as well have been Pittsburghers.
Yeah, and I know he said about his own work that the work was its own reward. And when I think of Pittsburgh, I think of people who work hard, who identify as workers. And David was a worker. I mean, he worked at his typewriter, really. It seems to me that I know that David wrote the Johnstown Flood book because he was curious about it, and he couldn't find a book that answered all of his questions. So he figured out maybe I need to write that book.
I've heard that story. He's repeated that.
He has said that.
What he I think sparked the interest is mentioned being in the Library of Congress and seeing a bunch of photographs. There were 200 commercial photographers that came after the flood. I mean, it was, the popular interest in that story at the time was huge, and he was intrigued by the extreme destruction of that community, and again, it wanted to get and the period histories weren't very good, and were not really satisfying.
Right.
So he wrote the book he always wanted to read. Yeah. That's how he would say it.
And I think writers do that. I mean, I think that's what, when you're looking for that topic, it's happened to me. I wrote books that I wanted to read. You want to rewrite the same thing. Although he did have the ability, other people have written about John Adams. No one's just written about it quite like he did. But I think a lot of that, you're looking for to fill that niche. He always used the word curiosity. He wanted to satisfy his own curiosity, and therefore it satisfied ours. I've always looked at him that way.
So,
Mary, can I add one thing?
Oh, absolutely, Frank.
I just want to add one thing about the Pittsburgh side of it. Yeah. David made a comment once that of all of the things that have been named after him or awards he's gotten, the one that he treasures the most is the naming of the 16th Street Bridge, the David McCullough Bridge. And I think that represents his view of being of Pittsburgh, not just from Pittsburgh.
Yeah. That's great. Frank, you are so right. I remember how happy he was, just thrilled that there would be a bridge named after him. First of all, the idea of a bridge, it's so evocative of the steel city, the rivers, all of that, and it came together for him.
And it's one of our most beautiful bridges too. Beautiful bronze sculptures on flanking both sides of the Allegheny River. And David had this aesthetic sense. When he was a boy, he couldn't decide whether he wanted to be an architect, an artist, an actor, a writer. So he ended up being all of them. He was a Renaissance man, but he appreciated the beauty of that bridge. And he was a painter too. I don't know if people know that his watercolors are phenomenal. And you could sense the acting ability in them. He was not just a raconteur, he could hold an audience in his hands and not let them go till the end of the hour, and then they breathed for the first time. He held them in thrall. So he was an amazing guy, but he loved that bridge.
So he was a historian, although he would describe himself as not a conventional historian. So you all must have opinions about what makes a good historian, because David McCullough was a good historian. What makes a good historian? Richard?
David was, of course, an historian, but he started out as a writer, and his literary skills, his ability to tell a story is unparalleled, and he involves you in the lives of the people and can quickly embody a character, so that historians in my training were academic, but that he could tell us, he was a narrative historian, and so he was at the pinnacle of his powers, writing a good story, and that was peopled by interesting people. And, you know, again, there's academic history and there's popular history, narrative history. And David was the master of the narrative.
Yeah. Story's everything, character, story, yeah.
And he allowed the story to go where the sources led him.
Yeah.
He, not like an academic historian who might come up with a thesis or try to prove something, set out to prove something, kind of a scientific method. His history was where the sources, the primary sources, the people led him. He didn't know where he was going to end up at the end of the story when he started. And I loved the way he wrote too, not only his Royal manual typewriter, which he wrote every book on, but he built himself a writing shack in Martha's Vineyard, which, if you can imagine, sort of an oversized outhouse. I mean, it was tall and narrow and square. And I said, David, it's out in the garden there, detached from the house. But, you know, why is it so small? And he said, it just has to be big enough for me to reach the books. And he'd had bookshelves on all sides of them, the books that he would use in his research, the stories that might inspire him. And you can just picture him there at his Royal typewriter, and then stopping and reaching, just without getting out of his chair, he could reach over and get those books, writing in the zone, telling stories, and then bringing them back to the house where Rosalie would read them. And you can't say that. Is that true? You know? That's how he wrote.
And it touches something, because I always, there's a YouTube video of his interview on that writing shack, because I don't have one, as my wife Colleen will tell you. I just have books spread out on the floor, so I'm so envious. But the thing, you know, and I may get to this a little later, there are actually academic historians who criticize David McCullough, and it drives me crazy. But anyway, you know, they write these deep, dense books that most of the public never sees or never reads. What he did, better than anyone else, is bring history to us, to people who aren't PhDs, which is most of us. And he made those stories come alive. I mean, I feel like I know John Adams. I feel like I know the Wright brothers. Well, my family has always gone to vacation in the Outer Banks. I've been to the Wright Brothers Memorial 57,000 times and thought I knew the story. And then I read this book that he wrote. Oh my God, I knew nothing about this. And I think you know, the master writer, the master narrative storyteller does that, and he leads you. And again, he satisfies his own curiosity, which in many ways satisfies all of ours. I think that's the greatest thing that he brings to the history profession.
Mary, I would say that Tom described him as a storyteller, and I think David would always have said, up until the day of his death, that he is not a historian, that he is a writer. And he had related a story of what he was told in college, the difference between a sequence of events and a story. And he says, the king has died and the queen has died. He said, that's a sequence of events. He said, the story is the king has died and the queen died of grief. He says, that's the story. And he wants to always tell you about the things that are left out when you read about somebody. He had an example of Teddy Roosevelt never talked about his mother. He always talked about his father. And David wanted to inquire on Mornings on Horseback why he never talked about his mother. And that was the genius to me of David McCullough. And I agree with Tom that he tells stories that those of us who make up most of the world are interested in reading.
Could I just add, because I think
Absolutely.
Frank's right on the money there, and so is Tom, and Richard, your comments about narrative history are right on. But David would say to me, he said, history is not facts. It's not about the facts. You can get all the facts right, but you won't understand the story. You won't understand the history. He said it was like the old piano teacher's lament to her student. I hear all the notes, but I hear no music. And that's what David could do. It wasn't just about stringing facts together. It was arranging them in such a way that it was music.
Yeah. And I think you've all touched on the most important things, the passion, the curiosity, the story. But what I keep hearing is that he was in pursuit of that book that he wanted to read, that story he wanted to learn, to hear. And because of that, he just kept digging and digging and digging. And as I've read, he said he came to know some of the characters in his books better than people he knew in real life, that he came to know them so well. I love that you all are so passionate about him. You know, you bring that same passion and love and care that he brought to his work.
He was such an inspiration to us. Mentor is almost too simple a word.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He was a muse. He inspired people. And I think it's great how he didn't just write a book about John Adams or the Wright brothers. He wrote about Abigail. He wrote about the Wright brothers' sister. He fleshed them out as human beings. And that's where the story was, the interaction between Abigail and John Adams. I mean, John Adams was kind of an acerbic, mean little character sometimes. Abigail was a joy and brilliant and funny and this counterpoint to John Adams, that if we didn't have her, if David McCullough hadn't dug her out of the archives and brought her to life for us, we really wouldn't have known John Adams.
Yeah.
Andy, his book on John Adams started as Adams and Jefferson.
Yeah.
And he dumped Jefferson because the letters from Abigail to John and John to Abigail were so compelling and so numerous that he said, that's the story, not Thomas Jefferson. So it became John Adams.
And Thomas Jefferson, already so much was written about him. And this was the uncovered story, the John Adams, Abigail Adams story.
I may, Johnstown Flood Museum opened more than 30 years ago. So we're doing some building renovation and some new exhibits. With digital media, you can do some great stuff. And we've had for many years, David McCullough interview on reel-to-reel tape of McCullough interviewing Dr. Victor Heiser, who his family died in the Johnstown flooding. Became a doctor, eventually the head of the World Health Organization. He was a 16-year-old boy at the time of the flood. And there's this, from 1966, this gripping interview that, now I know David wasn't thinking about the posterity and a digital video, but because he keeps interrupting Victor Heiser, but it's really beautiful. The Heiser's, he's an old man remembering these intense scenes and even chuckles, and David jumps in and encourages him. And so we're going to have this out later this year.
Wonderful.
So you actually hear David McCullough interviewing a Johnstown flood survivor.
Oh my
it's
God.
really wonderful.
That is wonderful. How does, thinking about David McCullough, how does that influence your own work as writers, historians, keepers of history, thinkers?
When I read his comments about his writing, I'm thrilled because I think it's the thing that writers think about. I think we're all motivated by the same thing. None of us do it as well as he does, but it's kind of the same thing. The stories you're looking for, to tell it, from that perspective. And I think that's the biggest influence. It almost gives you confidence that I'm not over here on an island. Even David McCullough thought this way. So I can think this way. I must be on the right path. And again, as I've said before, he's just his writing and his digging into topics is such an inspiration for what the rest of us do. We can't be him, but we try to be like him. We try to do, I always think I want to write a book that David McCullough might have appreciated, or try to, you never quite get there,
Right.
but that's the goal. So that influence is always there. And there are thousands of people out there, I think, who all will think the same way. That's his motivation, or his influence will last a long time.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say there are two things that David really inspired in me. And one is to always focus on the people, that people are interested in people. And whether I'm working on a museum exhibition or a book or a performance or a film documentary, the people are always centered in it. It's not about steel or aluminum or glass or architecture, as much as some of us love architecture. It's about the people behind those stories. It's not about the Brooklyn Bridge, it's about the bridge builder. It's not about the airplane, it's about the builders, the creators of it, and their stories. And the other thing that David, I think, inspired a whole generation of public historians is that there are so many tools in the historian's kit. It's really not just about books. He was a filmmaker, over 100 films he's part of, whether it's the Smithsonian History Series or the American Experience or Ken Burns' Civil War. I mean, can you imagine Ken Burns' Civil War without David McCullough's voice? It would fall flat. But with David McCullough, it rings true and is a story you can listen to again and again. So he recognized that the public historian had all these tools in their kit bag that perhaps an academic historian didn't have.
Right.
And when Ken Burns often uses the same narrator, the same moderator, the same voice. And when I first was watching Civil War, it was like, who's that? That's a different voice. And David McCullough makes it sound like history. I didn't realize who it was. It's a different voice. But it was so perfect. If he was going to choose a different voice, that was exactly the documentary to do it with, and exactly the person.
Mary, with the issues that Andy raised and all of the experiences that David had professionally, he also had a real sense of humility. I was lamenting to him one time about an election that I lost. And he said, well, Frank, you have to understand this. We all don't get what we want to have. And sometimes we get disappointed. He said, I did the American Experience for 10 years as a narrator and a host. I did a lot of other things. But the job I really wanted was to replace Alistair Cook on Masterpiece Theater. He said, and time came up and I tried to get that job and they picked Russell Baker. He said, I was disappointed. He said, so don't be too disappointed. Life will work out all right.
That's a wonderful story, Frank. That's great. Frank, all your work with the library, we are here in the library. Did David inspire any of your good commitment to the library system?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, David was all about education. The library is the single place in the society that you can go outside of school or after you've finished with school to learn. And David was a big believer in the fact that you don't teach dates, and that the sense of history and the sense of any subject is caught and not taught. That was his big saying, you catch it. And he took that from a woman named McFarland, who was at the University of Pittsburgh, talking about when you go to teach kids or teach adults, anybody, you have to show them the love that you have for the subject. And David so loved so many things, including the library. I mean, there was a time when I asked him to film a public service announcement for the library when we put in computers. And we had a saying that said, plug into the world at your library with a big picture of a computer. And David came to Pittsburgh with Rosalie on his way to Hawaii for a vacation and shot at the South Side Library this political public service announcement. Well, it turns out that the public service announcement, we thought we'd shoot it in one day, and it was going to take 2 days. So David, instead of saying, look, guys, I'm sorry, I can't stay this extra day, he sent Rosalie on to Hawaii. He stayed the second day and shot the public service announcement. And the tape of that announcement, the library has, and I sure hope they still have it and know where it is, because he spent 2 days in the Southside Library to shoot a commercial for the library to promote it to the public. And when I'm thinking of things that I can do for the library, and I say to myself, look at David gave up part of a vacation and sent Rosalie on alone to Hawaii so he could finish the commercial. Why couldn't we do more for the libraries in Allegheny County?
That's wonderful. I'm glad you mentioned that that philosophy that he learned from Margaret McFarland, that things are caught, not taught, because Fred Rogers always quoted Margaret McFarland as saying that. And it was the principle that everything is sort of osmosis going out there, and you can't, lecture somebody into something. As David did, he enthralled us with stories, gave us his passion so that we caught that passion. You wanted to hang out with John Adams and Abigail. Do you have a favorite book of his?
I'll go with the Johnstown Flood.
Well, I showed you this earlier, and I'll bring it out now. I brought, for good luck, I brought my own copy of Johnstown Flood, and it's inscribed from David. So it's very, very special to me. So I wanted to bring that, and it was the first David McCullough book I read. So it's kind of my touchstone. How about you, Andy? Do you have a favorite?
It's really hard. It's like deciding among your children. How can you do that? But those stories that deal with those family relations, Mornings on Horseback, Teddy Roosevelt as a boy, his parents desperately afraid that this child is turning blue and is going to die from this asthma, and just the terror in their young family as this frail child grew up in New York City. But then the story of Abigail and John is just so compelling and so sweet and revealing of these historical characters. But the Wright brothers and their sister, who knew? So
you haven't offended any of your children so far.
Good.
Yeah, everybody's okay.
I just feel that it's too hard to choose from among David's books. But your comment about Margaret McFarland and catching the spirit, or catching history, or catching the excitement or passion for a topic, David would always say that the teachers are who we ought to honor, that they were the people to whom we should be building monuments, not generals and sports heroes, but the teachers who share their passion, because that's what inspired him as a boy at the Linden School and growing up, those teachers, and you can see their influence in those books of his.
Mary, I would say,
I'll
pick one.
Yes, please.
Mine is Truman, and it's because of an outside influence. I had the chance with a few other people from the History Center before Andy came there to go to Independence, Missouri with David. And there were about 6 of us, including David. Andy would know Audrey Browerman was one of the 6. And we spent 2 or 3 days in Kansas City and Independence with him. And he really introduced us to the whole background of Harry Truman. I mean, if you want to go to the Truman Library, go with David McCullough. I mean, we went before the building opened, and they told us, you can see anything you want, but when you get to the clothing section, because there were his shirts from Key West, is like Hawaiian kind of shirts that he had. And we go down there and they said, you can't touch anything. The curator of that section is very particular. And David wore hats that are called Borsellino hats. They're a special kind of hat from Italy that he convinced me to buy. And you can fold them all up and put them in your pocket, take them out, and they still come out perfectly good. And it turns out Harry Truman wore Borsellino hats. And so I'm saying to this curator, who has a reputation for not letting anybody touch anything, I said to him, boy, I have a Borsellino hat, and David McCullough introduced me to that. And I see that Harry Truman wore Borsellino hats. He says, do you want to try it on? And I said, we were not supposed to touch anything. He says, you're with David McCullough. You can touch anything you want.
Wait, I have to riff on this story.
Okay.
Because that really is David McCullough. The tactile experience in an archive was really important to him. And we did an exhibit on the French and Indian War. Young George Washington surrenders his command at Fort Necessity. He's forced to sign a confession written in French, saying that I assassinated that French officer, Jules Manville, and started this war. And that letter that Washington signed got sent to Quebec, and then a copy was made and sent to Paris. The mayor hit the fan, the French and Indian War was on, but we borrowed that letter back from Quebec. It was still there from 1754, and it came to the Heinz History Center for this exhibit. David came because he wanted to see it. It was in our conservation lab, and they're wearing white lab coats, and everybody's got gloves on, white, Mickey Mouse gloves. And David looked around, and when the conservator wasn't looking, he said, Andy, don't tell anybody. And he took the little finger off his glove so he could touch the letter where Washington had signed it, this ancient parchment. And he just had to touch it to be in touch with the genuine article.
Yeah.
But I don't doubt for a minute that he put on Harry Truman's hat, Frank.
I put it on, Andy.
So he did. So you'd get kicked out. Yeah.
That's right. No, it was okay. But also, we go to the Truman House, which is only 2 blocks from the library. And there's a park ranger expecting us. And she sees David McCullough there. And she says to him, she says, well, Mr. McCullough, why don't you give the tour instead of me? And David says, oh, no, dear. He says, you give the tour. And so we go through the whole house with the park ranger and David and the rest of us. And we finish, and David thanks her for doing such a wonderful job. And then when she leaves, he tells us, well, these are some of the corrective things that I would tell you that she said that she didn't get quite right. But he would never do that in front of her. Yeah. He would never embarrass anybody. I mean, David had this great touch for little people. We stayed in the same hotel out at Independence, and he said to me, Frank, make sure you tip the housekeeper. And he really was big on, and I've heard him tell people that 6 times, you have to tip the housekeeper. People ignore the housekeeper in the hotel. She or he needs the money too.
Yeah. He lived his ethics. Rosalie might have been the keeper of ethics, but he certainly lived it. Yeah. Tom, do you have a favorite book?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes forget I'm on a panel here. These are such great stories to listen to. Some things that you learn. I do. I think John Adams it's my favorite book. I think it's his best book. I think it's the best history biography maybe ever written. I would go, well, we all have our different interests too. I would go, if I had to rank them, John Adams, Wright Brothers, 1776, and Johnstown Flood probably. But the other thing that tying off of that is the HBO series John Adams came off of David's book, and he was the consultant. And it's Hollywooded up a little bit naturally, but the one thing, we go back and reading some of his stuff after watching that program, The quotes were all accurate. Some of them weren't said by the exact right people because you couldn't add that many characters into it. But he made sure that those quotes, which were so essential to that process, especially around the Declaration of Independence, were in there. They were said, and they were part of the process. And I found, unless you dig deeply, you can't really know that. And it has an influence. I mean, my wife's probably worried I'm going to tell this story, but our music, as we entered it at our wedding reception, was the theme to John Adams. And we laughed at no one knew what it was except us. Or people said, "What's that song?" This is great. We're history nerds.
Now the world knows this. This is out now.
But I think we all have, his books could all tie for first too. I think we just have our personal interests of subjects we're interested in. There are a few that I haven't read because they're just topics that I'm not interested in, but so many of them are.
Right.
And I think that's, you're attracted to those.
Yeah.
If I could just amplify on my
Please.
3-word response before, I think
That was a good response, though.
well timed, but looking at this from the different perspective, I'm trying to right now retell, after all these years, there was a time that I thought if I could tell David McCullough's story of the Johnstown flood with artifacts and photographs, I had achieved perfection, and I did that. But there's a new story that's emerged in the last 55 years, much new data coming out of the legal history, and then particularly hydrology, different scientific disciplines. We now know, for instance, there's no American Society of Civil Engineers exonerated the club, and there's every indication now that the report was suppressed and then altered, and the disaster was an act of God. Well, it wasn't. It was an act of clearly neglect, and David suggests that, but leaves a vague. Well, there isn't. So what's I think difficult is gone beyond David to tell. We've had another 50 years of historical research, and that using methodology that he could not have anticipated.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to try to mash, do a mashup of new information with McCullough's compelling.
But
storytelling.
you can build on what he already wrote because it wasn't melodrama. It was the story.
It was what happened.
It was what happened. Yeah. How much do you think David judged his subjects? Do you think or did he just go along the road with them? What do you think?
I'll start.
Yeah, I think, as Andy said earlier, I think he didn't go in with a thesis, with an idea. He went in to write about John Adams or Truman or Johnstown flood and find what he found. And that's, I think the narrative historian does that. He doesn't come through with an idea. He's not making an argument. He's not necessarily trying to hold somebody accountable to power. He's just telling you the story. Yeah. In the John Adams book, one of the low points probably the lowest point of John Adams' presidency was the Alien Sedition Act. And David wrote about that, but he wrote about it from John Adams' perspective. It might have been wrong, but this is what he thought. And that was important to be like, okay, how could you do this? Okay, I disagree with it, but he kind of wrote from the perspective of the person that he was writing. And I think sometimes that academics who criticize him, they wouldn't have done it that way, which is fine, but maybe don't understand or don't appreciate that that's what he was trying to do. It's not defending them. This is why they did what they did, and then you can judge it. And I think there's a genius in that too, is not telling the reader what he or she are supposed to think. Here's what I found, and you can agree with it or disagree with it. Here's the reality. Yeah. You can look at this reality. And that's the thing between being, quote, a professional historian and a narrative storyteller that Andy and Frank and Richard have talked about. I think that's what he did. So when we criticize different people from different genres, we have to understand the perspective they're coming from. And I think this was always the perspective that David was coming from. But I think you raise a very interesting distinction
in that an academic might already have a point of view and go in with that point of view trying to prove it or
Which is valuable,
amplify
which
it.
is a valuable thing. We need it all, right? But we need this too.
But we need David more.
Yes,
We just need more of that,
yes.
I think. Well, because it is so generally appealing. It is so, and at this particular time in the world, I mean, we're in perilous times, right? Isn't history something we need more of? There was an article in the Times a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, that the way of historians is over. You know, people don't major in history, people don't get PhDs in history, people aren't writing history because it's just all out there.
This was very worrisome to David. He talked about it, and he often quoted Daniel Boorstin, the Librarian of Congress,
Right.
who said that trying to understand the past without knowing your history is like trying to plant cut flowers. You know, it's cut off. There are no roots there. Are they going to take? And he said that today it seems like we're trying to plant a lot of cut flowers, that people are disconnected from their past. And it worried him with especially the 250th anniversary of the United States, 2026, 1776, 250 years is almost upon us. And our democracy sometimes it seems like it's in the balance here. We're still fighting some of the same battles that we've fought for 250 years. And so this is something that I think we can do in David's honor and memory, is to don't try to plant cut flowers. We've got to build a good root structure.
How do we do
the
that?
next generation?
How do we do that, Andy?
I think it's the teachers, and it's what happens at home. We've got to celebrate the teachers, train the teachers, share that spark with them that Margaret McFarland talked about. They've got to catch history, and then they've got to share it with others. And we do it through historic sites, and we do it through film, and we do it through museums, we do it through performance, and we do it through art, all the tools in the kit. It's not just in the classroom that history happens and that learning happens. It's at the dinner table when you smash open the mashed potatoes and flood the peas.
Right.
The Johnstown flood, at the time, it was the biggest news story. It was a shocking story. And it had, in the middle of the, populist era, you have the Pittsburgh industrial leaders had a summer resort, and the faulty dam breaks and wipes out the workers' city of Johnstown. So it was, the whole country followed this. And so there really was a class element. Can you have a democracy when the owners get away with it? And can you have a democracy? So, it's not a new, it's an old story and it's a new story. And so it's one of these things that bears constant reexamination. And so, I feel lucky to be able to deal with that. David had to confront that tension. And then, because that was really central to the story, although his older brother, Hax McCullough, told me at one time that before they're in the process of publishing this, but they sent a copy of the manuscript to Richard King Mellon to read.
Whoops.
Who gave 2 thumbs up.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
So that's probably the first time I've told that story. But it would have all entered differently today, because within years they passed a strict liability.
Sure.
Each state adopted strict liability, not just fault. So.
Right. I read that David suggested that presidential candidates would have to take a test Any thoughts about that? Maybe a test about history, about being grounded, about knowing anything?
Wow.
We don't have to talk specifics. We can talk in generalities here.
Well, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service has a test of 100 questions that is put to every new citizen in the United States. And it's pretty basic. It's history and civics. Who was the first president? What are the three branches of government? How many stars were on the United States flag, and what do they stand for? I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. Only 4 out of 10 Americans could pass this test today. And so one of the things that David and I talked about is that by 2026, by the 250th anniversary of the United States, we want most Americans to be able to pass the citizenship test. So that's one of the things that we've taken on ourselves at the History Center, and we're working with the Smithsonian and 200 other museums around the country to get that Gen Z, that Generation Z, the 3 to 23-year-olds, to learn the basics of American history. Now, if our congressman could pass that test, that would be a bonus. But if we can get that younger generation of cut flowers, maybe we've got a chance in the future.
Mary, I would add
Yes.
what Andy has just said, that it would be hard to determine what political party David had sympathy with. And I only heard him make one comment that might have ever indicated something about a candidate. And he said that there was a particular candidate running for president who has never read a book about the history of the presidency. And he was really very concerned about that. But he's really stayed non-political. I mean, you can interpret whatever you want from his writings, but I would challenge anybody to say that he has made partial comments. He did make a comment once that I don't think was political, but it kind of goes with what Andy was talking about, the citizenship test, is he was speaking to college students and asked them, who was George Marshall? And none of them knew who George Marshall was. One student ventured to guess that he was the person who came up with martial law. And David was just flabbergasted that college students didn't know anything. There was nobody in the class knew anything about George Marshall.
You know, and to follow on Frank's comment, George Marshall was, of course, the general-in-chief during World War II, hired Dwight Eisenhower, was the confidant of FDR, and after World War II, it was George Marshall who rebuilt Europe, the Marshall Plan. He was a kid from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, a Western Pennsylvania boy. There's always a Western Pennsylvania connection in David McCullough's world.
I remember reading relative to presidential candidate having to take a test, and not political at all, but David wrote that that person ought to be able to say who was their favorite president and why, what was their favorite poem, what was the greatest book they ever read, you know, to have them be grounded, you know. Is there a book that you wish David had had time to write?
I've got one, because he and I used to talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
I kept badgering him, David, you've got to write the history of Pittsburgh book. You've got to do the Pittsburgh book. I mean, let's face it, we don't have a good Pittsburgh book. This is the essential American city. David would be the first to say it. And yet, we couldn't quite figure out the angle of attack on this book, because you can't follow one family all the way through. It's made up of people from all over the world. It's just this melting pot, and it's this stew of innovation and can-do spirit. And, you know, how do you tell the story of this city? He was the first to say it's the only city in America that makes an entrance. You know, you come through that Fort Pitt tunnel and there it is, arrayed before you. He loved the drama of that. But how do you tell its story? So when I last spoke to him, he said, Andy, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to do the book. I'm not sure I'm up to it. The other book that we talked about doing, it was actually, as we were talking about the Pittsburgh book, and we talked about doing a film about Pittsburgh, a knock your socks off film about, you know, why is Pittsburgh here and why are Pittsburghers the way they are? We were just going to do a short documentary film about it. And he asked me, well, who else, what other biography do you think America needs to know about? And over dinner in Boston one night with Rick Burns, Ken Burns' brother and the co-filmmaker, we threw out ideas. But the one that I suggested to him, I know you may think this is nuts, but I said, Robert E. Lee. If America could understand Robert E. Lee, I mean, here's this intelligent guy, superintendent of West Point, hero of the Mexican-American War, this, you know, marries the granddaughter of George Washington and Mary Custis, just deeply embedded in the history of the United States. And yet he's on the wrong side of this rebellion that is centered on slave owning. And yet we are fighting that Civil War today. The question is not when did the Civil War begin and when did it end? It's when will it end? And so we talked about, you know, if you could understand Robert E. Lee's thinking on this, the very symbol of the Confederacy, maybe we could figure out ourselves and our time today. He was too much of a Yankee to do it. And he knew the thing that he needed to write a book was a trove of letters, of primary source materials. Lee had that, but he couldn't go south of the Mason-Dixon line, I think, to get it done. Doing George Washington in 1776 was as far as he could go. As far as and that's a great study of that general, that young man who cut his teeth in battle here in Western Pennsylvania in 1753 to 1755, young George Washington, 21-year-old George Washington, red-haired, 6 foot 2.5 inch tall, gangly Virginia youth George Washington. That's the George Washington that inspired David McCullough to then write 1776 and try to get into his head when America, when our democracy hung by a thread.
And Mary, I think it's very difficult for somebody to give you an assignment to write a book. Books are hard work. They're you love it. I love it when I dig into it, and I know Mr. McCullough did. But it's still hard work, and it has to be right here. There can be a great topic that somebody's, and you might even be slightly interested in. At my meager level, I've started 2 books that have a couple of chapters in, I said, it's just not there, because I know the road that it takes to get to the end, and you really have to write about what you're curious about. So I always, to follow up on what Andy said, I've always been, the Civil War has always been my greatest interest. I always wanted to write something about the Civil War. And even though so much has been written, there's still so much that you can still do. And people wrote about John Adams and the Wright brothers and all these things before him too. He just wrote about it differently. But I guess something just never touched him that said, I'm going to put forth, because especially at his level of books, where you're taking sometimes 7-10 years to do it, you really have to love it. And so that's part of it too. It can't just be an assignment. It can't be somebody throwing it out. You have to, I think anybody who's tried to do that knows what I'm talking about.
Mary, I'd take a little different approach.
Okay.
David was involved with the MacArthur Foundation. They give out the MacArthur Genius Grants, and he was involved in the selection process for a period of time. And to me, like he wrote The Greater Journey and talked about August St. Gaudens and Samuel Morse and a number of other Americans in Paris. I'd wonder what he would think about writing a story about the evolution of the recipients of the Genius Grants, and just pick a few of them to write about. Because you hear about them, you hear about what they're given, and then you never hear anything more about them. I don't know if that would interest him or not, but that's a subject that there's not much written about.
You know, these suggestions, maybe you're going to have to take them up yourselves. Maybe
that's the book that you need to
get
read,
busy.
and
Get
so you
busy.
better write it, Frank. You've still got some time.
Right.
Thanks for the generous suggestion. I still have time, Andy. I'm getting up there.
Yeah, you've got it in you, buddy.
You know, as I was thinking about our time together today, because they'd gotten in touch with me before the holiday, and I was watching It's a Wonderful Life, you know, that seasonal standby film, and how Jimmy Stewart as George Bailey gets taken by Clarence to see what would have happened to the town if he hadn't been there. And I was just wondering, not to go to a dark place, but to just think about what our world would be like today if we hadn't had David McCullough in it.
I wouldn't be in Johnstown for the last 40 years.
Yeah, that's one thing, that's right. Well, and the Johnstown
Destiny, yeah.
might be, you know, Potterville.
Potterville, yeah.
Potterville.
Yeah, I like that film a lot too. Yeah, but for me, so being the town historian has its satisfactions.
And you can thank David McCullough for that. That's good. Andy?
I wouldn't be in Pittsburgh if it weren't for David McCullough. But your comment about It's a Wonderful Life and Jimmy Stewart, who is, of course, a Western Pennsylvanian, and David McCullough loved him, that wasn't David McCullough's favorite movie, Jimmy Stewart movie. It was Harvey. Remember Harvey, the 6-foot puka, the sort of mysterious invisible rabbit who followed Jimmy Stewart around? David loved that movie. And even in high school, he drew pictures of Harvey standing behind David. In his high school yearbook, you'll see a picture of Harvey and David McCullough. He was an artist even then. And there was something whimsical about Harvey and sort of the odd character that Jimmy Stewart plays in this film. You know, we don't really know, is he crazy, or is there really a 6-foot invisible rabbit there? There are clues that could lead you either way. And I think David, maybe it was his dramatic flair, or just his sense of humor and whimsy that drew him to Harvey.
Yeah.
I would say, Mary, that if you'd pardon me for being a little bit selfish, if there were no David McCullough, I wouldn't have as many of the numerous notes that he's written me over the years. I mean, David was a prolific handwriting note giver. I never sent an email, always got a note. My oldest son wrote a letter to David when my son was in college and wanted to be a writer. And David sent him probably a 2.5 page letter back, responding to him.
Of course he did.
He just was generous with his time and his suggestions and advice, but you have these handwritten notes from him that we've always treasured.
I don't know what you're going to do with those notes, Frank, but at the Heinz History Center, we have a David McCullough collection. We'd love to add that whole collection to it.
I've given you a lot of things so far, Andy, so hopefully they'll make it to your way at some point.
Mary, we'd be, I think, as a society or a country, we'd be less informed. But think of all the people that he inspired to get involved in history. Writers and history teachers and magazine writers and newspaper reporters and just people maybe in this room who just loved history. You know, in sports, where I spent most of my professional career, we talk about coaching trees, the Bill Belichick coaching tree and all of his assistants who are now coaches elsewhere, and Nick Saban's coaching tree and where they go. Think of David McCullough's history tree. You couldn't quantify it. Most people are not even identified. You couldn't possibly know, but think of all the people. I'm sure they're direct people who he influenced, but all the other people out there who he influenced by reading John Adams or 1776 or Truman or Johnstown Flood or whatever, got interested in some part of history and became a teacher, became a lecturer. And that's really his impact. You know, some of us go on to ancestry.com. It's his ancestry.com history tree, and it can never be quantified. I said, but it's out there and it's immense. And that may be his biggest contribution to the country now and going forward.
When the Johnstown, I guess it was the same time the Johnstown flood came out in 1968, they released a summarized version of it in Reader's Digest condensed books. And I was getting visitors 40 years afterwards that have read that. Was it that that generation is kind of not traveling anymore? But at any rate, this has reached mass audience. And Johnstown had come to the point where they'd pretty much a lot of the business leaders didn't want to talk about the flood. We're a flood city, but don't talk about it. We've solved the, and they didn't. But yeah, the notion that you can talk about this and share this and people find inspiration in this story, it's been a good thing for the community.
Yeah.
Mary, let me get in a plug for the library. Andy and I have given enough plugs at History Center, but David would show up for lots of things that didn't get any real publicity to help at the library. I mean, he and Rosalie came in at a point whenever I had to retire. Andrew Carnegie's wisdom was you have to leave the board of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh when you're 75. And so a few years ago, he and Rosalie came in for a party at the library that was in my honor. And I was ecstatic that he would take the time to fly in here and participate in this. But you might have seen in the preceding, if you were waiting to get on to this before 1 o'clock, they had a bunch of photos. And while I was speaking at one point at this event, David came up and gave me a big kiss. And there's a photograph of that in that group. I mean, that's just, he had a side to him that was so humorous and I don't want to say devilish, but he would just do surprising things. And he really loved the library. Each time he came, he'd ask to have a tour through the library to see what's going on and what was new. So Andrew, there's my plug for the library.
Good job.
No, it's absolutely true. You talk about his mischievous, perhaps, but certainly full of fun, full of life. He said that the only thing that separates people from cabbages is curiosity. And he was curious always. And he had, I'm not surprised that Harvey was his favorite Jimmy Stewart movie, because as I remember in that movie, Jimmy Stewart just sort of tested everybody out by just, I have this friend here, and you might not be able to see him, but maybe you'll make room for him. Just sort of making people come into a quiet world with him. And I think David does that with us, doesn't he? Brings us into a world with him and says, sit down for a minute. Here's my friend John Adams. You might want to spend some time with him, or here's Harry Truman, or and he does that. Yeah.
And when you were in his presence, he gave you his full attention. He looked you in the eye. There could be no one else in the room, even if it was a crowded room. He had your full attention, and you got a sense that he cared about you.
Absolutely.
And David was as far from a cabbage as as God ever made. And the other thing, as you said that, I thought of the life in the man. He had a great singing voice. You know, that voice of his, which was just so melodious in narrating documentary films. Well, when he broke out in song, it was a thing of beauty. And the thing to match it was his dancing ability with Rosalie. And Rosalie didn't dance on the floor. She floated over the floor. And with David, even with a broken foot, for his 80th birthday, when we dedicated the David McCullough Bridge, the 16th Street Bridge, he danced the night away with an air cast on his foot. He was just a remarkable man and the life of the party, and yet he could be so thoughtful and sincere and focused when he talked with you.
I think this takes us back a little bit to the whole idea of Pittsburgh. Because Pittsburgh people are very down to earth. What you see is what you get, you know. Are you having fries with that, hun? I don't know. You know, I mean, it's just very, very straightforward. And those qualities you described about David McCullough makes me think of Fred Rogers, who is also present always. Gave you his full attention. There was nobody else but who he was ever talking to. And Fred, although from Latrobe Ligonier, was a Pittsburgher. And so let's imagine that you have the opportunity, you're strolling through the library today, and you bump into David McCullough. What would you say to him? Do you have a question? Do you have a comment? Do you have a thought?
Why didn't you write a book on the Civil War?
Here's my card.
I think there's if you've read one of his books, as informative as they are, you know there's so much more there. You know, there's so much when you research that's fascinating stuff that you can't possibly get into your book. There would have to be 800 pages. So I would want to say, okay, John Adams, Wright brothers, tell me what didn't make it into the book. It's still fascinating.
You want the outtakes.
Yes, exactly. Because I guarantee you they are fascinating. And he was probably frustrated that he couldn't get in. But at some point, he also had a great quote, which I think is, I've had arguments with editors about this too. You could research forever. You would never write the book. You could research for 5 years, 10 years. Right. At some point, and he said this, you just have to sit down and write. And there might be something out there that you don't find out, and hopefully someone will follow up later. But there are things with that you do find that you just can't wedge into the book. And I would like to know what some of those stories are.
You might have a very long conversation then.
Yeah.
Might not be just a passing in the hallway.
Yeah.
Mary, I would ask him, David was the eternal optimist. And if I ran into him at the library today, I would say to him, David, tell me how we're going to get out of this political logjam that we seem to have gotten ourselves into. And I'm sure he will cite to me several things in history where in this country we've had similar situations. But he would, I would leave that discussion with him with a feeling then that things are going to be okay. It'll work out, and we've been in worse situations in the past. His optimism was just so contagious.
So you would be able to leave that conversation with some hope.
Yes, you couldn't
thing.
possibly leave without hope from talking to him about these things, because again, is with Andy's view about roots and planting live flowers. David knows the history and would tell you about problems that went on with the Ku Klux Klan or Andrew Johnson's administration and so many other things that he would put them all in perspective with what's going on today.
David, where are you? Any thoughts? What would you say, Richard? What would you say, Andy?
I know that if I saw him in the hallway right here at the Carnegie Library today, we'd immediately start talking about the film that we were going to do about Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah.
And the angle that we would take that would capture both the spirit of the city, but the imagination and the interest of the audience, because he felt that Pittsburgh needed this film that would expose Pittsburgh to the world. And so I'm sure we would go into that. And then in the mercenary way that nonprofit CEOs think, I would say, and can you help with the capital campaign? And he would say yes.
Talk to Frank about that $4 million.
Yeah, right. Well, Frank, I know he's done his bit, but I'm going to be talking to you some more, Frank. So.
I guess what I would like to tell David is just thank you for his graciousness. I mean, he was always there. I went to his home and filmed him to do a fundraising promo, and he was, gracious then. Throughout, he's come to Johnstown, done fundraising events. Great, it's always great to be in his presence. I remember though trying to get him interested in the current project we're working on, and he'd be thinking about museums and public engagement, and before I could get him excited about what I was doing, he'd say, "My friend Andy Masich, you should see what he's." So I was always trying to compete with him unsuccessfully to get.
I don't know about that. Right?
Yeah, but I thought it was just graciousness.
Yeah.
It's just a kind, caring person, and always helpful.
Well, I think thank you is a very good thing to say to David McCullough from all of us. Thank you, David McCullough.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I think we have some questions from the audience, perhaps, that can be given to our lovely panel here.
A lot of questions.
The great thing is everyone's got a David McCullough story.
Right.
Whether they met him at a book talk or on the street or went to school with him or were inspired by one of his books, he touched all of us in so many ways. And I'm sure everyone in this audience has a David McCullough story.
Even if it's only the book you read and what it meant to you. I remember we were driving back from New England to Pittsburgh, and we put the Harry Truman book on the car audio tape at the time. And it was just like traveling through time with Harry Truman. It was so wonderful. It was just incredible. Have some questions here? All right, friends. Okay, we'll be serving dinner tonight because obviously this is going on for a while. Interesting question. Who should write David McCullough's biography?
Tom.
No.
That would be a hard one,
No,
right?
that would be a hard one. I would say it would probably be best to one of his contemporaries, but I just don't know who he was closest with. It would be a challenging one to do, and maybe we don't need it. Maybe it's already out there. Maybe he's told us his biography, much as I would like to read it, through his books and his, I will occasionally just go on and watch one of the book talks that he did at a library somewhere on Truman or Wright brothers and watch that. And that's why I said, even though I didn't meet him, I feel like I know him.
Absolutely.
So maybe part of that, and maybe doing events like this too, where I've learned some things about him too. I'd still like to read it. I just don't know who the perfect person would be.
Good answer.
I do think that his daughter, Dory Lawson, with whom he's co-authored a book with, might be the one to give us the insider story of David McCullough from the family's point of view. Because I think Tom's
That's a
right.
good one.
David revealed himself through his books and through his lectures, through his commencement speeches. But I think Dory would give us an interesting insider's look.
And that would be a perspective that no one else could
Right.
have.
That's right.
That's great.
Mary, can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
I would urge people to see a couple of the things that are still preserved. Morley Safer's interview of him 10 years ago or more on 60 Minutes. I mean, it's almost an autobiography you could do of David by putting together his interviews with Charlie Rose over many years.
That's a good idea.
And
Yeah.
so we can almost do our own biographies by just going to YouTube and finding a lot of those things.
That's a good idea. How can the writings and values of David McCullough help us navigate perilous times?
Well, I think the answer to that is that, whatever the perilous moment, it's happened before. It didn't just happen, maybe climate change, but and then that's the value of history in general, is that you look at things developmentally, and knowing what preceded is really critical to understanding whatever the issue is.
There was the plague.
It's about change and continuity over time. It's about how things got this way. So, if you want to know how we got here, then that's a discipline.
And I think David would add that nothing is preordained. Those people that he wrote about in the past, they didn't know what was going to happen next. And that's true of us today. We can make a difference. We can chart our own path. And so I think that message of hope that Frank talked about was definitely part of David's outlook, that you need to understand the past to make good decisions in the present and plans for the future, but nothing is set. You can change the course of history.
That connects too with the optimism that Frank referred to, that there is hope. You don't have to give up just because it's perilous times.
Right.
You can take action.
And individuals do that.
And individuals do that. Gosh, what a novel idea. I love that. Love that idea.
Well, there's a whole generation or two of historians who focus on social history.
Right.
Big movements, big trends, statistical analysis of our societies and demographic studies. These are all important things to know. But David focused on biography, on individuals. And for some academic historians, that's, as you pointed out, that's no longer in vogue. But David tried to bring us back to people can make a difference, individual people, not alone, of course. All of those stories involve many people, but an individual can make a difference.
Takes me back to Fred Rogers, that every individual is unique and special and can make a difference. What was the primary influence in Mr. McCullough's life that drew him to the study of history? Any thoughts?
That pile of photographs in the Library of Congress?
Seeing the photographs in the Library of Congress and not knowing the story behind them.
It goes back to that word curiosity.
Yep.
As Andy said, he didn't know what he was going to do. And if you read the short biographies that are out there, he wasn't sure. He was writing for American Heritage. He kind of fell into book writing. He didn't know he was going to be this prolific author of books before he started doing research in Johnstown. I think it's a lesson to all of us in our careers who just explore things. you might find your path. But ultimately, had that curiosity not been there, he would not have followed this path. He probably would have been still great at whatever he did, but it wouldn't have been this one, because I think a historian or a storyteller, either way, has to have that quest for more knowledge.
I think both of those answers are right on, but I would add, I think it began at the dinner table. I think it began with his parents.
You always want to go back to mashed
The mashed potatoes and the peas.
Always.
I really do think at our homes, our parents, our families, they set us on a course, whether they do it consciously or not. That's where we're shaped. And that curiosity, I think, grew out of the family storytelling at night.
And you mentioned earlier that the statue should be to teachers. Parents are teachers.
Absolutely.
You know, uncles and aunts and sisters and brothers, we are all teachers. And we have that weight upon us to do something with it. Oh, what would he think of banning books, eliminating components of our history from students' education?
No,
David always
We know what he would think.
Let
Frank,
me
you're
just
the
add one
librarian.
thing, Mary.
What?
David always lamented the fact that the arts were de-emphasized now in public education, especially in elementary schools.
Right.
And he decried that. He thought that that was such a shame that when they were doing budget cuts, that they would cut the art and the music and all of those kinds of things from the curriculum. So, I mean, I just think David would always stand up for artists and free expression.
I agree, Frank, and I think the whole notion of cancel culture was something that horrified him. Even the pulling down of statues. I think he would say, don't pull down statues, build up new ones to the teachers, but understand where we came from. And it's not about tearing down other people's history. It's about advancing new voices and new stories and have them coexist. The notion of banning books and burning books, he would have been on the front line of fighting such a thing.
Or covering up things. I mean, thinking about the Johnstown flood, the impulse would have been, let's not talk about that. That was an awful thing. It was a disaster. Let's forget about it. But his attitude was, no, let's find out the full story. Let's look deeper at that.
I talked to him later, 5 years ago, about some of the new research that indicated how, in reaction to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club basically not being found civilly or criminally liable for the disaster, and how they created, state by state, very quickly, a new standard of tort law, and that how those fortunes, Pittsburgh fortunes, might have been diminished. And what's interesting about him, despite that, sense that something was wrong here, he took a different view, I found surprising, which is, look at what those fortunes have done to Pittsburgh and this country. And maybe, there's another side of this too.
Yeah,
So,
it's a fuller story.
Again, the easy thing to do is blame the club like everyone did. And, David had a far more nuanced. So he was about as far from a book, he was toying with something that would not be maybe a popular sentiment.
Absolutely, absolutely. How do you think Mr. McCullough would feel about the present day internet and the ability to look up all kinds of history, verified and unverified?
I got a good story there too. Al Roker, the weatherman, is a published man. He's written many books, including one fairly recently on the Johnstown flood. And obviously he'd read David's book, and with far less economy, he did a credible book, but he never came to Johnstown, never talked to anybody. And unfortunately, then he read everything, including some of the more recent, publications. Unfortunately, he read this one book, The Bosses Club. It was local folklore. And it was just, I mean, how the club members broke the dam so they could, get at the coal reserves in Windber. It was like, it's just 100-year-old gossip nonsense. And, again, that's not how you, I mean, you don't do all your research online. It's not, you're not going to, you'll get, sent in the wrong direction. And that's what happened to the poor weatherman.
I think it's you have to be selective though about it and intelligent about it, because the internet itself for internet research is not all bad either. There are so many things now. There's so many primary source documents that are available that someone like me sitting here in Pittsburgh would have never had access to, would have never had the time to go to all these places and all these libraries in Boston and DC or wherever and spend that time. Now you can, there's the Library of Congress has something called the Archives Founders Online. It's all the letters of the 8 or 9 primary founders between 1760 and 1790, all there, right there. So if you're doing primary source documents, and the Archives and Library of Congress, they're digitizing more things. If you're doing it all from Wikipedia, or you're reading people's blogs, yes. So I think when you're reading those things, you have to look at the footnotes and the sources and see who the writer is using. And if he or she are using primary source documents, it doesn't matter that it's on the internet. And in my case, I can't imagine how some of these people in the 20s and 30s and 40s did this research, did ancestry research. Right. There's now so much at your fingers. It's so much easier to do now, as long as you yourself are selective and know you're bringing it from proper primary sources.
I think he recognized the value of the internet and how much primary source material there was available today. But remember, it evolved over his lifetime. He was born in 1933. He did most of his research in archives. He loved the musty smell of the archives, and he loved to take his finger out of the glove and touch the original. But I think he did have research assistants with his last few books, people who were able to access things, scans of things, but then they usually got printed out and put on his bookshelf so he could grab it off the shelf as he sat at his manual Royal typewriter.
Mary, I could add this.
Yes.
He has said that the part of the internet that I think he would dislike the most is email, because he thinks it has corrupted our language. And he is really big on the preservation of language. And if you'd ever hear him using internet talk or email talk about the line from John Kennedy's inaugural address, ask, what you know what it is you can do for your country. That's not what they can do for you, but, and he went on like that. And he says, it's just terrible that people are not paying enough attention to language, and he charges email with a big part of that crime.
And he did have such a beautiful hand in writing, cursive writing. And he pointed out to me one time, he said that kids today can't go to an archive and use primary source documents because they can't read cursive writing. If it's not printed, they can't read it. They certainly can't write it, but they can, it's like Greek to them. It's a foreign language to them.
It's a skill you need to learn.
And he had this beautiful flowing hand, elegant cursive writing.
Yeah, I have a couple David McCullough letter notes.
To your knowledge, did David have a favorite author or historian?
I'm sorry?
To your knowledge, did David have a favorite author or historian? An author or historian that he admired?
Well, he always talked about Thornton Wilder and the teachers that he had at Yale. And I've heard a lot of quotes from him about Thornton Wilder and some of the other English people who taught English and literature at Yale. I never heard him talk about a historian. Andy, did you?
No, it's a really good question, I think, because we did talk about Thornton Wilder and the Bridge of San Luis Rey, and telling a story that where lives converge on a bridge that collapses. That's the kind of story and suspense and drama that David would build into his writing. But we talked about Daniel Boorstin, the historian of the Library of Congress, or the librarian of Congress, and he loved his way of thinking. But I don't think David would point to any one historian, and as you said, Frank, he didn't consider himself an historian. He considered himself a writer who did some history. So I don't think he would say, here's my favorite historian.
That's right. He obviously was a consummate historian by the end, but he was such a facile writer that, again, to weave a story, a tale that just is gripping.
Who are any writers today that tell stories in a similar vein to David? Anybody? This person says Seabiscuit's Laura Hildenbrand comes to mind.
Well, there are. Go ahead, Frank.
I just think I like Candace Millar. I mean, I think she writes, especially her book about President Garfield. I thought that she writes in similar tone than David.
Yeah, I think the Eric Larsons of the world, and The Devil in the White City, and things like that. There's kind of narrative history. There's some extrapolation going on there that even David would say, "Whoa, don't make up stuff." But history is interesting enough. Just learn to tell the story right. But I think there are narrative historians, as we've talked about, who do good history, but they can write in a narrative style that the general public can follow along. They're not academic monographs. And so I think David has inspired a generation of narrative historians. And I do think, thank goodness for the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, a repository for all of this great literature. There's still a demand for good history. Books are still being published at record rates. And people are still reading. Sometimes they're doing audio books, and they're not all sitting down with a paper book in their hands. They're reading it on their iPads or their screens, or they're listening to it in their car. But great literature and good history, narrative history, is still in vogue.
One of his colleagues, contemporaries, Joseph Ellis, who's a professor but writes also for the masses, and very well wrote so much on the Revolution, and also wrote about John Adams and John and Abigail. Have a lot of his books and enjoy that. And I think then you have the narrative biographers of John Meacham and Walter Isaacson, who write about Jefferson and Franklin.
That's right, sure.
And Meacham just wrote about Lincoln, and you see him on TV. He's given a modernized version. I mean, nobody's David, but they don't want to be either. You have to be yourself. They all have their own styles, but it's kind of the same genre of bringing that history to life. As Andy said, we hope there are more coming.
Ron Chernow, Hamilton and Grant. And some of these others that have gained so much momentum, as others are inspired by, Lin-Manuel Miranda with Hamilton on Broadway. Think what that did. It's kind of like David McCullough and Ken Burns together on the Civil War, how that just changed America. Look what Hamilton has done.
And he was inspired by a book.
By Ron Chernow's
book. I mean, it starts with the word, doesn't it?
Right.
It starts with a story. Stories are never going to go out of fashion. And stories about real things being told in truth are going to always be compelling, let us hope. For any young people out there who may wonder, what high school did David attend, and did he play any sports? He went to Shadyside Academy, I believe, high school. We know that he was a dancer. I don't know that he played any sports. Pittsburgh has more bridges than any other city. How was the 16th Street Bridge chosen for David?
I know I was in on that
Okay,
deal,
wow.
and we sat down with Willie McCain, the county manager, and Rich Fitzgerald was an advocate, and we put together a little committee because I know I had advanced the idea of David McCullough having a bridge named for him, and yet there had never been a bridge named for a living person in the history of Pittsburgh. And Rich Fitzgerald and Willie McCain said to me, well, how are we going to get that by people? He's not dead yet. And I said, but we got to do it while he's still around, because if anybody is more beloved than David McCullough as a son of Pittsburgh, I can't think who they would be. And so we involved others in a process of vetting this idea of the David McCullough Bridge, and it didn't run into any opposition. There were a few other names that were advanced. They were more political kinds of things, but it was so evident to people that David McCullough was deserving of a fine bridge, not just some concrete bunker of a bridge that we throw across rivers and ravines today, but something elegant, something beautiful, something made of articulated steel and bronze. And so the 16th Street Bridge was the only one that kind of fit that bill. And the day that that bridge was dedicated, I mentioned to you, I think it was his 80th birthday, and he had air cast on his foot. He had broken his foot somehow. I can't even remember how, probably dancing. And it was a rainy day. It started raining when we were going to go out on the bridge. And so everybody just stayed at the History Center for a big party, but David wanted to go out to his bridge. So we took him out there, and there was a golf cart, and they closed the bridge for that day, just for David, because there was supposed to be a party on it. And he rode the length of the bridge because he couldn't walk it, and rode back. And then his family came out. There's a wonderful picture of them standing right by the entrance of the bridge on the strip side of the 16th Street Bridge, now the David McCullough Bridge. And there's a little kind of bas-relief plaque there that has his image on it. And it was a proud and happy day. And he danced, broken foot and all, the night away. And there was a Dixieland band playing, because he loved Dixieland music. And he was in heaven.
Well, you have to look at the proximity, Mary, of those bridges. You go from the Clementi Bridge, the Warhol Bridge, the Rachel Carson Bridge, and McCullough. So it makes sense to make the 16th Street Bridge named after David.
Right.
And it connects the old Heinz plant to the Strip District. I mean, two iconic Pittsburgh places. It was the right bridge.
And you're absolutely right. It's a bridge, just as he admired the Brooklyn Bridge as a work of art, as well as a monumental bridge. The 16th Street Bridge is a work of art, and just like all of his books.
Frank is a bridge historian. He knows all this stuff, and working for the county. But the first suspension bridge on our rivers here was actually on the Allegheny River, just downstream from where the 16th Street Bridge was. It was actually built by John Roebling, the inventor, the designer of the Brooklyn Bridge, whom David wrote about. And that bridge was actually an aqueduct bridge that brought canal boats from the North Shore over to where the Pennsylvanian is now, the train station. That was a big turnaround bowl, big bowl of water. The mules would pull the boats across this suspension bridge, And they'd unload their supplies, turn around in this big bowl of water, and then the mules would tow them back across the tow path, across that first suspension bridge. So it's
perfect.
oh, it's just perfect.
That's perfect. We're coming to the end of our time together, and I just wonder if you have a final thing you would like to leave our audience with. Anybody? We've already said thank you, David, which is the appropriate ending, but
Well,
anything else?
I would say, I think what David might say is that keep reading, keep supporting the institutions that you love and believe in, whether it's the Johnstown Flood Museum or the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Support authors who are doing good work. Come to the Heinz History Center and learn about the city and our roots, and maybe apply your historical knowledge to make good decisions in the present and plans for the future.
You channeled David very nicely. That was good. Larry, do you have anything you'd like to leave us with? Frank, I'm sorry.
Oh, Larry's my brother.
Frank, do you have any?
Anyhow, yeah, I mean, just Andy has said most of it. I mean, he's accurate about that. But just that when you think of David and his writings and his life, he is, and I've said this earlier in the program, he is not just from Pittsburgh, he is of Pittsburgh. And that's a unique thing in the world. A lot of people can be from here, but David represents the values that we all aspire to. Friendship, citizenship, love of your city, pride for what we do here, and hope for the future.
Very nicely said. You are also channeling David. That's good. Tom?
I think if we I think the biggest tribute is just to keep history alive, as it's taught less in school, as it seems to be less important, but it still is going to be very important, and there are just other ways to get it. I think that's the biggest tribute to him. And we say history is about who we are and why we are the way we are.
Right.
And as
right.
convoluted as that sounds, think what that means. That's what it is. And we just need to pass that on to the next generation, so that there will be more David McCulloughs, or more people like David McCullough. And someday they'll be having 75 years from now, this panel here in this building about somebody else who was inspired by the work he did.
That's good. Richard?
Well, it's awkward being after those beautiful summaries. Again, I think something we touched on today, there was this sense of people will rise to challenge. People, there's reason for hope, and that we're in a world of challenge, and think of Johnstown. Everything you knew was gone, and David so captures the resolute determination. People crawl out of the wreckage, and that afternoon they're appointing committees, and that says something very inspiring about the spirit of humans.
Spirit of humans. Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Frank, I apologize. My husband's a Red Sox fan, so of course I was thinking of your brother. Beg your pardon. Frank, thank you so much. Tom, Andy, Richard, thank you. It's been so much fun to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So thank you to all of you for joining us today, and for those of you who joined us virtually. I hope the discussion met and exceeded your expectations, both about history, about how hard or difficult it is for the writer to present it to us, and I think for others in the field to endorse that and present it to others and to encourage us. I want to acknowledge, which Mary did very nicely, so thank you again to Richard, to Andy, to Tom, to Frank, and thank you to Mary. You did a wonderful job with this. I was very happy with it. I think the whole event went beyond anything I expected and those of us who planned it. I would also like to acknowledge Banac's sound production for the work they did here. It is a level of professional production I have not been a part of in my time with the library, and that is a considerable length of time. We're now going to say goodbye to our virtual audience. That is their cue, something new, something I wouldn't have dreamt of 30 years ago. And I